The Brothers I Choose by J.D. Hurst. Copyright 2023 Hurst Haven Enterprises, LLC. All rights reserved. The characters and events portrayed in this book are fictitious. Any similarity to real persons, living or dead, is coincidental and not intended by the author. No part of this book may be reproduced or stored in a retrieval system, or transmitted in any form or by any means, electronic, mechanical, photocopying, recording, or otherwise, without express written permission of the publisher. This one is for my love, Nate the Great, who supports me 100% in everything I do, cheers for me, and helps me back up when I fall. Just like the dedication on my original Airborne Wings says, "Thank you for being the wind beneath my wings. A.M.L.F. and A.Y." Prologue, Freshman Year of High School. Defensive coordinator for the high school football team, Coach Chris Brown, sat in the stands with the other parents at the girls' fall league soccer state tournament. But he wasn't like the other parents. He was, and always would be, a coach first, and he watched every sport his daughter Gracie played in with a critical eye. He had admitted to himself that his daughter was a mediocre player, and made the mistake of saying the same to his wife. He had received the cold shoulder treatment for the rest of Gracie's 8th grade season, which had been an effective training mechanism for him. He'd keep his opinions to himself from now on, but he couldn't help but notice another player on Gracie's team, though. It would have been weird for any other dad to notice another 14-year-old little girl, but Coach Brown couldn't help himself. Though the child was all gangly legs and arms and stood head and shoulders above her teammates, she had none of the lack of coordination that the other first-year students seemed to be fighting. Though new to the school, having not been in Gracie's 8th grade classes, the girl had tried out for the soccer team and quickly risen to both a starting freshman and team captain, much to the dismay of the upperclassmen on the team. Gracie had whined with her friends, though he suspected she didn't really care about the preferential treatment toward this new girl who no one knew anything about. But Coach Brown couldn't fault the soccer coach. There was literally no way to disguise the fact that the girl was not only the leading scorer on the team, and probably in the state of Oklahoma, but also a natural-born leader. Though the older girls had resented her fast track to high school soccer stardom, they couldn't deny that she was still a team player and led with a quiet strength devoid of arrogance or flash. The girls all tried to pass the ball to her if they got it because he had never seen her miss a goal attempt, but she regularly busied herself aggressively defending, pretending not to notice that one of her teammates wanted her to take the shot. As it was, Gracie's team was storming through the fall league season, making it look easy with Bridlin Vison at the helm. Coach Brown couldn't stop thinking about the star athlete, but only in an athletic coaching kind of way. He didn't get to watch as many matches as his wife would have liked because football was running at the same time. But when he did get to a game, Miss Vison gave the same performance every time. Gracie rotated in and out, as it should be, but the young captain stayed on the field for the duration. The soccer coach had given up trying to get her to take a break. The team wavered when she sat down, and it was obvious to everyone, but especially Coach Brown, that the girl would sooner claw her eyes out than rest. Rarely had he seen a high school athlete with the tunnel vision drive that this young woman exhibited every moment of every day. He was ashamed to catch himself wishing that his own daughter would find similar motivation. He had secretly hoped that his daughter would break through the gender barrier in football, but again he had to be honest with himself as a coach and recognize that Gracie was not only not interested in breaking down barriers, but she resented football since it kept her father's attention elsewhere for the majority of the school year. The thought that he might be able to coax Miss Vison away from the soccer team niggled at the back of his mind, as the season wore on, and he often noticed her sitting in the empty stands watching the football team practice. Coach Brown was waiting for Gracie in the hallway with his wife after another win perpetuated by Miss Fison, when the athlete in question slipped quietly out of the locker room long before any of the other girls. She tried to slip past them with a nod, but Coach Brown couldn't resist the urge to talk to her. "Good game, Miss Fison. You were outstanding, as usual," he smiled. His wife startled from digging through her purse and glanced up at him questioningly. He kept his gaze steady on the girl who had paused in her stride down the hall. "Thank you, sir." Her voice held the softest Oklahoma lilt that tipped the edges of her words up in the gentlest way, like an encouraging pat on the back. "I'm Gracie Brown's daddy," he stated, and wondered why he was holding the child, who was obviously anxious to get away. "Yes, sir. I know who you are. You're also our defensive coordinator for the football team. Our boys are doing pretty good this year." She smiled patiently. He grinned. "They're putting up a good fight anyway." He thought about his frustration with special teams, the kicker in particular, which really was the heart of the matter, why he was delaying this girl who had to be tired after an hour and a half straight of high-octane soccer. "You ever kick a football?" he blurted. His wife snorted next to him. He ignored her. There are many throughout the world that subscribe to the notion that a soccer ball is a football. There was that patient and indulgent smile again. In fact, it is widely thought that the soccer ball is the original football. He dipped his chin in acquiescence. "Yes, ma'am, that is true." He squinted at her. "I was referring to the American version of a football with pointy ends." He suppressed a smile. The girl returned his smile. "I may have batted one around here or there, sir." He nodded, but any response he may have given was cut off by the flood of girls spitting out of the locker room. He glanced toward the locker room door, where Gracie was just emerging with two other girls, and when he looked back, Miss Fison was gone. As the students settled into the school year and fall league sports wore on, Coach Brown continued to see the young soccer star lingering around the football field, and he noticed that even when everyone else had gone home, she was still at the school. One late night, as he was prepping for a particularly tough matchup for the football team, he was getting ready to leave for home, but remembered that some of the players had wanted to run through some more drills, and they had left the lights on at the field. He said good night to the rest of the coaching staff and headed to shut down the lights. Just as he was reaching for the huge switches, he heard the distinct snick of a foot connecting with a football out on the field. He knew that sound. It was one of his favorite football sounds, and one he could not ignore even at this late hour. He headed out to tell his less than stellar kicker to save himself for the big game on Friday. They needed everything the kid had. Coach Brown pulled up short when he saw who was lined up on the 50-yard line with 6 footballs on kicking tees on the line. Long black ponytail trailing down her back, there was the star soccer player, making it look easy again, only this time on his field. She put her foot to the next football in the line, and the ball neatly split the uprights in the end zone. Coach almost called out to her, but couldn't bring himself to break her rhythm. She was practicing kicking his football at the 50-yard line, and every kick was slicing through the uprights as if drawing an invisible and identical line through the air. The football team's kicker was practicing at the 35 to 40-yard line and wasn't usually brought into a game before the offensive line reached the 30-yard line. He realized that if the girl turned around and found this old man watching her work, he would come across as a creeper. So he just turned away without talking to her, filed the exhibition away for future reference, and went home without turning the high-powered football field lights off. It was just going to have to be okay this time. Weeks later, the football team was struggling through a brutal away game hours from home. The kicker had just shanked another field goal attempt, and Coach Brown was working hard to control his temper with the special teams coach. Head coach Reed was holding in an angry tirade next to him, arms crossed over his barrel chest and chin tucked as far as it would go. The punter had come up on the ineligible list for poor grades earlier in the week, so the kicker was doing double duty. Both coaches held their breath as the boy trotted uncertainly out to the football in the center of the end zone. They were down by a touchdown and needed the kicker to do something right tonight. The boy ran up to the kicking tee, nearly missed the ball, and wobbled it to the first in the receiving team's line, creating a short and easy return for the other team. The punt returner tucked the ball into his side snugly and lowered his head, breaking through every one of Coach Brown and Coach Reed's team. The boy was fast, and he was zeroed in on the end zone, looking like he was going to have a moment of glory when he returned the kick for a touchdown. Before it even registered what was happening, Coach Reed's kicker flew into the ball returner and flattened him. Both coaches erupted with triumphant cheers. The kicker that they both dreaded seeing on the field had saved the day, or at least the moment. Coach Brown immediately started hustling his defense onto the field, but a moment later the entire stadium hushed, as neither boy involved in the miraculous play had gotten up yet. The referees knelt over the boys, and trainers from both sides ran onto the field to check on their players. 10 minutes later, both boys were wheeled off the field on gurneys to waiting ambulances. The entire crowd was subdued, but there was 13 minutes left in the game, and they all had to set to finishing it, as the announcer mentioned that their thoughts and prayers would go with both injured players. "Who else on this team can kick, Davis?" Coach Reed growled at the special teams coach as the defense fought to hold the offense to the 20-yard line. Coach Davis looked overwhelmed and even a little frantic. He knew that kicking was their greatest weakness this year. He had tried several different players, willing or not, in the kicker spot, and none had been able to remedy the situation. Coach Brown wanted to feel sorry for the guy whose job was in serious jeopardy, since the kicker had lost several games for them that year, but he was too frustrated with the man's inability to train his kicker better. He remembered that Gracie and her teams were on the soccer field at this school too, as his wife had asked him to bring Gracie home with him and the football team instead of riding home with the soccer team. He went still. He knew what he had to do. It was time. "Coach," he spoke up. Coach Reed looked at him. "My daughter's soccer team is here. Their match finished about half an hour ago." Coach Reed was shaking his head before Coach Brown finished. "Gracie hasn't ever played football, has she?" "What? Gracie?" "No, not Gracie. She wouldn't." Coach Brown was sounding as confused as he felt. "Bridlin Bison. She's the leading scorer on the team. I saw her kicking our football a few weeks ago. She was perfect. I mean, completely perfect. She didn't miss once, and she was kicking from the 50. Coach Reed squinted at him suspiciously. "Yeah, but what about defenders in her face?" Coach Brown shrugged. "Soccer players are way more in her face than our football players ever could be, and I've never seen her miss a goal either." Coach Davis looked like he was holding his breath, praying that this girl would be allowed to save his job. Coach Reed heaved a sigh as the opposing team flinched into the end zone. "Check with the refs to make sure we're good. Then see if you can get the girl here in 3 minutes or less." Coach Brown was already directing an equipment tech to run and find Miss Fison. Moments later, the young soccer player was standing next to Coach Brown, receiving quick expectations brief from Coach Davis as the team prepared to punt to the opposition, again after failing to score. She was still in her soccer shorts and jersey, but had crammed the kicker's helmet down over her thick hair. Coach Brown marveled at how calm she seemed as she listened intently to Coach Davis explaining that he just wanted her to get the ball close to the opposite end zone. The refs blew their whistles, indicating that the slight leeway they'd been given to bring in a new kicker had expired and play would resume, ready or not. The girl trotted out to the ball with the special team and lined up as if she'd been doing it all her life. The whistle blew and she ran at the ball without hesitation. The ball flew through the air and landed behind the opposite field goal, untouched. Coach Davis's jaw went slack, and Coach Reed's eyebrows bounced up in surprise. Coach Brown crossed his arms over his chest in satisfaction. The opposing team would automatically start from their 20-yard line, leaving 80 yards to fight his defensive line. He knew his boys were up to the task, and just maybe they might be a little testosterone charged, since there was now a girl on the field with them. The girls' soccer team was beyond upset, but Bridlin Fison fell in love with football that day and quit the soccer team to finish the season out with the football team, since their original kicker had broken his neck when he tackled the kick returner and would never play football again. She promised to return for spring league soccer. The following year, Bridlin returned to the football team as their permanent kicker and proceeded to nail every field goal attempt and keep opposing teams' kick returners limited to very deep returns. Halfway through the season, the quarterback is holding the ball for her to kick an extra point after a touchdown. It's supposed to be a trick play, and the quarterback is supposed to jump up and throw the ball in for 2 extra points, but he fumbles the snap. The ball bounces away from him back toward her. She knows who is supposed to get the ball, so she picks it up and completes the play as planned. Everyone is shocked that she smoothly executes the play without ever having practiced it. At the next game, the quarterback is gravely injured. The second-string quarterback is ineligible for grades, and the third-string quarterback goes down too. "Brid!" Coach Reed yells as the third quarterback is helped to the sidelines. The tall, slender young woman runs to his side, her light kicker's padding bouncing. "Sir," she responds, observing the field, trying to guess the next play. "You know our playbook." The coach cast a sidelong glance at her. It was a statement, not a question. He knew she studied the playbook religiously. "Yes, sir. What do you need me to do?" Her answer didn't surprise him. She was always ready to do the next thing the team needed. "I think you know what the next play is," he grunted. "We need a quarterback, sir. I'm thinking you're wanting a surprise here if we want to win." Funny how she didn't say finish the game. She had such an indomitable spirit. They had just exhausted their third and final option for quarterback, but she was thinking about the win, not the finish. He nodded and waited for her to realize what he was asking her to do. Football coaches around the state had laughed at him when he made the girl his full-time kicker, but they had soon quieted when they had to sit on the sidelines and watch her dismantle their scores. They would laugh again when they saw her lined up behind his offensive line, but he doubted she had the ability to be anything less than successful at everything she put her hand to. He was about to find out. She turned to him with wide eyes. "Me, Coach?" she asked incredulously, excitement dancing in her eyes. He nodded again and eyed her speculatively. "Long bomb to Edwards. Got it?" The team was at third down, and they had a long way to go to get the first down. He hoped their opponents were expecting them to go for a little more yardage before sending her in to kick a field goal. She glanced out at the team waiting in the center of the field and nodded as well. She looked back at him with determination. "You got it, Coach." She hustled out to her waiting teammates, who quickly huddled around her to cover the fact that their female kicker was taking over at quarterback. Coach Reed watched with pride as they all leaned in to get the play from her. A few of the boys cast furtive glances at him, but he didn't acknowledge them. He just adopted his standard crossed-arms stance and waited for the whistle to blow. He could hear the other coaches across the field laughing along with their defense when they saw the kicker ready to take the snap from the center. He stifled his own chuckle when her feminine voice rang out across the field with directions to her line. The spectators in the audience laughed too. And then Edwards was sprinting with everything he had to catch up with the most beautifully thrown spiraling football he'd seen in a long time. A satisfying thud as the ball slid into his wide receiver's hands, and the crowd was on their feet, roaring their encouragement as Edwards flew into the end zone for a game-tying touchdown. Britt played the rest of that game at quarterback and still kicked her own extra points. They got the win, as she'd suggested they would. The regular quarterbacks were injured for the next 2 games, and his original starting quarterback was out for the rest of the year. Britt finished the season as quarterback and led the team to a state championship. They hadn't even been to the playoffs in over a decade, so not only was she an anomaly as a female starting quarterback, but she put her high school back in the spotlight for their winning record as well. Football practice started up a full month before school started for her junior year, and Coach Reed made her try out for quarterback, even though he had little doubt where he would put her on his team. She bowed her head humbly when he announced the tryout results, naming her as starting quarterback. They blasted through the football season, walking into the state championship game at 10-0 and walking out as repeat state champions. National sports news syndicates were clamoring for interviews with the female football phenom. Colleges and universities were not as enthusiastic, but a few had come calling, offering scholarships and backup quarterback or kicker positions. Senior year football practice started on a blistering hot July day, with tryouts beginning at 6 o'clock in the morning. Britt lined up with the other would-be quarterbacks, noticing a few fresh faces in the group, but one stood out in particular. At 6 foot even, Britt didn't look up at very many of her teammates, but a brash young man who had transferred to their school district over the summer towered over her. He seemed to think that his height advantage alone was enough to give him the starting quarterback position. She had to admit he was a really good quarterback with a high pass completion rate. He was extremely unhappy when he learned that Coach Reed had given him the backup quarterback position and a chance to try out for a starting tight end position. The boy was livid when he found out he would be backup quarterback to a girl. As the team waited for their coaches to begin a team meeting, the boy decided to voice his displeasure. "I've been a starting quarterback since I was a freshman. I'm not a backup. Coach is an idiot if he thinks I'm going to stand for this. I'm already being recruited by major universities around the country," he boasted hotly. Britt almost laughed when her teammates unconsciously circled around her and faced the new player. They were not only loyal to her, but they respected their coaches and were none too happy about the newcomer's disrespectful attitude. In Oklahoma, football was an entire culture, and boys were raised to play and show Southern respect to those in charge. She almost felt bad for the new guy, who had come in from Washington State with his military father. She didn't get up from the bench she was straddling in the team room. She continued rubbing at a dull spot on her helmet, taking her time in forming an answer. As long as Coach Reed didn't overhear Kellen O'Donnell tossing his attitude around, the boy would be on the team, and they would all need to be able to play well together. She needed to diffuse this situation and maintain team cohesion. "Kellen, Coach Reed has been ridiculed and discredited for choosing me as his starting quarterback. I took that personally and made sure that all of his critics had to eat their words. He asked me to help him out of a jam 3 years ago when he had no other options. I was not ever going to let him down, regardless of how much time I had in the position. He took a massive risk on me, and with the help of this amazing team," she gestured to the young men surrounding her, "we are the team to beat. We're Oklahoma State high school football champions. From where I'm sitting, it seems to me that Coach Reed is doing something right." She leveled a serious stare on Callan, who had the decency to squirm uncomfortably. "If you want the starting quarterback position, you'll have to hope I get hurt. You're going to have to take the job from me, and I will not just bow out gracefully. I'm not going to fight you this season. I'll continue to do whatever job Coach Reed gives me to the best of my ability until I physically cannot continue. And then I'll throw another touchdown pass for good measure." Her teammates laughed. Coach Reed walked in, followed by Coach Brown and Coach Davis, and the room fell silent. Coach Reed took in the group of football players circled around his quarterback, facing off with the talented young man who had come in from Washington. The boy's face was red, and the coach could see that he was in foreign territory. He'd probably never had anyone choose someone other than him to align with. "Mr. O'Donnell, do we have a problem?" Coach Reed crossed his arms sternly. "Coach, I've never been a backup to anyone. I'm a starting quarterback." Callan's chin poked out mulishly. "Young man, I understand that you have an exceptionally good record back in Washington. I can also see that you are a talented football player. But what kind of coach would I be if I tossed my excellent starting quarterback of the last 3 years off to the side just because someone new came in? Brid is the kind of leader every coach in the country wishes they could have on their football field. These guys weren't overly excited to work with a girl, but I believe that I speak for all of them when I say she quietly earned their respect, and any one of them would choose her over anyone else in the country given the chance." Murmurs of assent followed the coach's statement. Brid's heart warmed. She loved these boys, her brothers, the family she had been allowed to build for herself in lieu of an actual blood-related one. She had been in the foster care system for as long as she could remember, and had found a way to stay hidden at night at the school since her freshman year. As far as she knew, her last foster mother was still collecting the funds from the state for Brid's care, but thankfully had never come looking for her. Callan stood alone opposite the entire team and coaching staff, looking like he wanted to fight, but being forced to recognize that this was not a fight that could be won. Brid's heart went out to him. She remembered all too clearly what it felt like to be standing alone against the world. She stood and straightened her back. She lifted her chin and approached him slowly, fully aware that every eye in the room was on her. His eyes widened as she approached. She was struck again by how incredibly tall he was. It made her feel oddly feminine, standing there looking so far up at him. She couldn't look at that too closely. She had no time for silly schoolgirl notions. She squared her shoulders and held out her hand. "Callan, I saw you run those tight end routes this morning when Coach asked you to. I would have never guessed that you had never played the position. You looked so natural and comfortable. If you could see your way to try something new for this team, I think we can do some really incredible things together." She held his gaze as an angry storm of emotions raged in the depths of his blue eyes. She waited for him to accept her handshake, but he was clearly torn. He had no choice but to be in this school district, at this high school. His father had been stationed at the nearby military installation, and Callan was only 17, so he couldn't go out on his own yet. "Mr. O'Donnell, may I remind you that we are a state championship team, looking to repeat for a 3rd year in a row. You don't have to play for this team, but it's a heck of an opportunity, son. One that at least 10 other young men that I know of are vying for, their parents willing to move to our district so they can play for us." Coach Reed inserted when the silence stretched on. Callan looked ready to explode as he glared down at Brid and her unwaveringly outstretched hand. Finally, though it seemed to cost him everything he had. He slapped his palm against Brid's, squeezing tightly and leaning toward her slightly. "Don't get hurt," he growled menacingly. If he'd intended to intimidate her, he was sorely disappointed. She simply cocked an eyebrow dispassionately and turned back to her team. Senior year of football season roared in with an opening day pep rally for the ages. Brit's team was taken somewhat by surprise by the ferocity of their opposition and had to fight harder than they ever had to barely squeak by for the win. The grumblings in the locker room after the tough win were not kind toward the new tight end. Callan was quick to defend that it wouldn't have been so hard if they didn't have a girl at the helm. Charlie Edwards gave Callan a swollen jaw for the comment. Coach Reed suspended both of them for the next game, and the team faced their first loss in 3 years. The third game of the season was another struggle, and even Britt had grabbed Callan by his helmet's face mask in the huddle, trying to make sure he was listening to her. He was clearly distracted and off-kilter. Coach Reed switched to a run-based offense, and Britt handed the ball off to her 2 running backs as well as running in a touchdown herself. Having enjoyed the benefits of an extra protective offensive line during her high school football career, she was surprised to find herself sore and beat up at the end of the game. Her offensive line mumbled apologies to her as they filed past into the locker room. They took her busted lip and bruised cheek personally, as they had all taken it upon themselves to keep her from getting hurt. She had wanted to scoff at their decidedly testosterone-driven protectiveness, as she figured that if she wanted to play football with the boys, she would have to take hits like the boys did too. She held her tongue, though. This tough game had just reinforced her sincere gratitude and appreciation for her normally unmovable line that usually refused to allow a defender through to her. They had barely won the game by a last-second field goal. "O'Donnell," she called as she invaded the boys' locker room, after giving them all time to shower and change. The room fell silent as she walked into the midst of them. She normally didn't come into their locker room, opting to meet in the team room instead for the sake of propriety. It was a small concession that no one seemed to mind. Callan sat in the middle of the locker room, straddling a bunch, his head down. He didn't acknowledge his quarterback. Britt touched his shoulder, but he didn't respond. She swung around in front of him and copied his straddle, facing him. "Callan!" She waited for him to look up. Callan flicked his glance up at her, but looked away quickly. Not fast enough, though. Britt caught the shimmer of tears in his eyes. "What's up, Callan? You weren't in the game tonight." She didn't add that he hadn't been what they were expecting him to be since the beginning of the season. He seemed to be downtrodden enough without her stating the obvious. He looked at his clasped hands as his throat worked at what she suspected was a ball of emotion. "Anything we can help you work out, Bud?" she coaxed gently. She could feel the team leaning in to hear his answer. Callan had been outstanding in practice, and the team had begrudgingly accepted him as their tight end. Her team was loyal to a fault, and once you were in for good. "I'm sorry, Cap," Callan mumbled without looking at her. "I let personal stuff mess with my head." Britt could hardly believe her ears. Had the unapologetically arrogant Callan O'Donnell just apologized to her, the female quarterback, that he exponentially resented beyond reason? "What's up, Bud? Maybe we can help. We need you in the game." She dipped her head, trying to get into his field of view. He drew a shaky breath. "My grandma's dying. She's in Texas. My dad is deployed. I'm trying to get there to see her before—" He swallowed hard. "But there's school and games, and my dad is trying to get home, too." He trailed off. Britt sat up straight and looked around at her teammates, who all wore sympathetic expressions. That surprised her, though it shouldn't. Southern kids were by nature remarkably close to their families. Even seeing one of their least favorite teammates facing the imminent death of the matriarch of his family hit hard. just a little too close to home. Her chin firmed as she decided what she had to do. Well, let's go. We don't have a game until next Friday. She stood up and Callan's head snapped up. He searched her face. What about practice and class? Coach? She grinned down at him as she picked up the keys to his truck from the bench in front of him and tossed them in the air and caught them. I'll explain to Coach. He'll understand. Come on, let's go before it gets too late. I'll drive. She hoped she was right. She hoped Coach would give them a little leeway, even though the last 3 games had been lackluster at best. Why would you do this for me, Fison? He demanded. Y'all don't even like me. She smiled. Because you're my teammate. We're supposed to help each other through rough times, she stated simply. The rest of the team quietly stood to their feet and palmed their own keys. They would follow her, even to the family funeral for the one who had not been able to accept them as his team. Coach wasn't happy about it, but he did understand. Brid got Callan to the hospital an hour before his grandmother passed away peacefully, surrounded by her family, except for Callan's dad, who wasn't able to make it until the day before the funeral. The team stayed with Callan through the weekend and the funeral that took place that Tuesday. They all showed up extra early on Wednesday morning, and Coach cooked them hard and long in practice. But somehow they had congealed as a team through the act of rallying around their own. They were unshakable. Callan had fallen in love with his team over the weekend and was filled with renewed energy, though his heart was heavy with grief over the loss of his grandmother. He was determined to never be the weakest link on his team again. The team stormed the state championship game once again, with only that one loss marring their record, and became the first high school football team to three-peat as state champions in decades. College recruiters swarmed the players before they left the stadium, with one notable exception. Brid watched the melee from the background, happy for her teammates that were being offered multiple opportunities at prestigious football schools around the country. She was surprised when a man in a black athletic shirt trimmed in gold with a large golden A on his chest broke away from the pack and headed in her direction. His salt and pepper hair was neatly trimmed in a military style, and he lowered his head as he stopped in front of her. He grimaced and crossed his arms over his chest. Brid absently wondered if they taught that stance in football coaching school, as she smiled at him expectantly. Miss Fison? The man asked. It didn't seem that he was excited to have a conversation with her. Yes, sir. She waited. She'd learned long ago that it did no good to jump ahead in a conversation before someone was ready to proceed. I've been instructed to offer you a full-ride scholarship to the United States Military Academy at West Point, he stated. His tone made it clear that he was acting against his own wishes. She blinked at him. What? 2 community colleges had offered her football scholarships, but made it clear that she would not be in a starting position. She imagined this offer was the same. To do what, sir? She blurted. She cringed. She was normally incredibly careful in her speech, taking pains to be polite and above reproach. He glowered at her, apparently misinterpreting her response as an effort to make him grovel. We want you to play football for us. The military is the leading organization in equality and recognition of talented leaders, regardless of race, gender, religion, he recited. Ah, affirmative action. Gender equality. She had heard about the military's efforts to diversify and provide opportunity for whoever wanted it. In what position, sir? It's been a few years since I kicked, she stated flatly. The man grimaced again. He really wasn't liking this task he'd been directed to do. We want you to try out for quarterback. He looked like he'd tasted something terrible. Be forewarned, though, freshmen rarely get a starting role. The 4-year degree program scholarship will remain in effect as long as your grades are within eligibility, even if you never play. We'll find something for you to do. It was a backhanded offer, and they both knew it. Brid envisioned herself as an equipment manager, squirting water through the face masks of the real players. She normally had no trouble accepting opportunities with humble gratitude, but she had to admit that this stung a little. And at the end of the 4 years, regardless of what task I'm given, she couldn't help but poke a little. He blinked at her, surprised that she was pushing back. Well, you'll be given the opportunity to commission into the military, of course. Brid hadn't given the military any thought. She had thought about this being her last season as a member of the football team. She had acknowledged that it was going to rip her heart out of her chest to say goodbye to the only family she had when they graduated in the spring. She knew she would go to college determined to become more than the little girl who had been abandoned by her parents and forgotten in the foster care system. But she hadn't known what she would study or how she would pay for college. She had been trying to figure out how to tailor her team leading skills into a successful career. And even as the declination of the stilted offer was on the tip of her tongue, she realized that she was built to be a soldier. She was loyal and dedicated and willing to go to any length to build her team. She was tough and in excellent physical condition. The military was one of the few organizations that a person was expected to be a good teammate for the duration of one's career. She had heard how soldiers often adopted their fellow soldiers as family, since they were rarely near their actual families. And though she was offended by the man's attitude, she found herself nodding in agreement. "I'll be happy to try out for the football team, sir. Be forewarned, though, I rarely sit on the sidelines." She grinned confidently at him. Graduation day dawned, clear and bright, despite Brid's best efforts to hold back time. It was the first time any of her teammates had seen her shed a tear, even if only just one. 4 of her teammates had pledged to follow her to West Point. 2 of her offensive linemen, Charlie Edwards and Callan O'Donnell, despite both of them being heavily recruited for other universities. She wasn't sure if it was some twisted sense of duty on Callan's part, but she wouldn't deny that she was selfishly happy she would be taking some family with her into her new life. She and Callan had been inseparable since she had stood next to him at his grandmother's funeral. They were teased constantly about being an old married couple, but they had never been romantically involved, though Brid secretly harbored a different love for him than she did the rest of the team, whom she thought of as the best brothers a girl could ever ask for. Even if Callan never knew that she loved him differently than the others, she was glad she would be going to many of the same classes as him, and would have him in her life, even if only as a best friend. Though football scholarships had been issued to Brid and Callan for the military academy at West Point, tryouts to determine their positions on the team were still required. Callan easily established himself as an asset at tight end, and surprisingly, he was given a starting role. Not surprisingly, despite Brid's immaculate high school record at quarterback, she was slotted as a third-string quarterback. She knew it was the coach's way of complying with the requirement to list a woman on the team roster while not opening himself up to national humiliation. They had all seen tape of her performances, but had done nothing to assuage the fear that it would be a nationally televised disaster to put a woman at the helm of a ranked college football team. Brid offered to return to kicking, as she could not stand to sit still on the sideline while the team took the field. Her offer was firmly turned down. They had a decent kicker that was fairly dependable. Charlie Edwards was a second-string wide receiver, so at least she had company on the bench. Her offensive linemen hadn't made the team, but were throwing themselves into the military lifestyle demanded of the cadets, and Brid, Charlie, and Callan saw them regularly. Brid struggled to be patient and wait for her opportunity to play. She feared it could be years, but she practiced just as much as she had in high school, And when she was filling the empty hours between the school closing in the evening and the stolen sleep she snagged every night on the floor of an abandoned storage closet. After nearly 4 years of those sleeping arrangements, getting up hours before any staff showed up to the school, it was strange for Brid to sleep in a bed in a dorm room that she shared with a member of the women's softball team. Getting up early to participate in military physical training before class was as comfortable as an old shoe, and she frequently bore the brunt of her classmates' disgruntled objection to the early hours when she showed up, eager to get started. The only members of the freshman class that could keep up with her in the physical challenges were Callan and Charlie. The second-string quarterback was called into action for the second game of the season after the starting quarterback was arrested for DUI. He was kicked out of the school, never to be heard of again on a collegiate football field. The second-string quarterback was completely lacking in confidence and fell apart on national television. The team suffered a humiliating, scoreless loss, but the coach didn't even glance in Brid's direction. She bit back her frustration week after week as she watched the young man shut down under the pressure at each game. They were officially the laughingstock of college football. The coach was unmovable. The fifth game of the season started out as dismally as the preceding games when the quarterback fumbled his first snap and the opposing team picked up the ball and ran it in for a touchdown. Brid tried to crush the helmet she'd held in her lap the entire season between her clenched fists. The quarterback lined up to take the next snap, but never saw the ball as an overzealous defender leaped over the offensive line and flattened him. The young man didn't move for what seemed like forever. He was eventually carted off the field on a stretcher. Charlie nudged her and grinned. Brid couldn't help but return his enthusiasm, even though she felt bad for being happy that her chance was here at the expense of her teammate. When the coach roared at the other coaches for any player that had ever quarterbacked, completely ignoring the fact that he still had a quarterback to call on, Brid's jaw dropped as she fell back on the bench and Charlie surged to his feet angrily. To the other coaches' credit, they all looked at her. One reminded the head coach that she was on the roster as a quarterback. His face turned purple and he swore at the coach. "Absolutely not! There has to be someone else," he bellowed. Charlie pushed toward the coach, despite Brid's best effort to hold him back. "Coach, you have another quarterback on your roster. She's ready to go now," Charlie yelled as he approached. Brid feared he was ruining any chance he might have had to play football at this school. The coach who had mentioned her repeated the regulations that had been read to him over his headset that stated you had to play an able-bodied player in the position they were slotted in if circumstances demanded it. Every vein in the head coach's neck, cheek, and forehead bulged with rage. Brid was afraid he was going to stroke out right there. "How much worse can it really get for us, sir? We're the butt of every joke right now." Charlie jutted his chin stubbornly. Brid wasn't sure if she was grateful for his almost endorsement or irritated with him. He knew she would be better than the boy who had been in the games to this point. A referee ran up to the coach, demanding that play resume and the coach get his team in order. For a moment it seemed that the coach was going to forfeit the game rather than put Brid in the game at quarterback, but he glanced up into the stands and his shoulders slumped in defeat. Whatever he had seen up there changed his mind. "Cadet Bison, get out there and don't come crying to me when you get hurt," he bellowed and turned away. Brid was already running onto the field with the assistant head coach giving her the play as she moved. She was fairly certain that the assistant coach had made the decision, as it was a different play than the head coach had been calling lately. The offensive line swore and grumbled as she walked into the huddle, but she looked at Callan, who shot her a proud smile. It was all the bolstering she needed. "Listen, guys, I know you're not excited to see me, but as one of the coaches pointed out, the rules state if you have a player available in a position that needs to be filled on the field, that's the way it has to be. We can exhaust ourselves whining about the circumstances, or we can rally and try to clean up this mess. I need your help, gentlemen. I know we can do this, but we have to be a team. Just give me one chance. I promise I won't let you down if you can give me 15 seconds in the pocket. If you can't do that, y'all are in the wrong sport." They grumbled, but lined up. The play was supposed to get the ball to the wide receiver, but when Britt looked for him, he was completely covered by 2 defenders. She scanned the field and caught Callan running far downfield out of the corner of her eye. She hoped he was paying attention because she released the ball as the pocket collapsed and the defensive tackle barreled into her. She vaguely heard the roar of the crowd as she lay trying to catch a breath. The defender shoved into her sternum as he propelled himself to his feet and smirked at her when she gasped in pain. One of her linemen leaned over her to see if she was okay, but she grasped his hand that he had not offered and dragged herself upright. She was normally cool, calm, and collected on the football field, but she was mad right now. One thing she had never been able to abide was a bully, and the opposing team's defensive tackle had just crossed that line. She would make it her personal mission to make this game miserable for him. She looked downfield to realize that Callan was being pounded on the back by his fellow teammates in the end zone. Touchdown? She could hardly believe her eyes. Not because she doubted herself or Callan, but because the team was not working well together, and the offensive line had not been able to hold the pocket for even 10 seconds. Callan looked back at her just then, and she smiled with a fist pump of victory. He grinned and inclined his head in congratulations. The rest of the game was a fierce battle, but Britt was able to pull the team to their 2nd win of the season. They didn't lose another game the rest of the season, and though the head coach never said anything, he was no longer angry when giving her the plays he wanted her to execute. The following year, the head coach had retired, and the assistant coach, who had come to Britt's defense, had taken over the head coaching role. The new coach didn't even make her try out. He was a believer in Britt's abilities, and he had been fielding questions from the media for months on whether or not he was bringing back the female quarterback. He had answered resolutely every time that he would absolutely be giving her the hard-earned role again. They went 10-2 and played in a bowl game the week before Christmas. Junior year football season began, and everyone was talking about the woman who was leading a contending college football team. The team went 11-1 and played in the national championship, much to the shock of collegiate football. Senior year, the team went undefeated and won the national championship, again shocking collegiate football. Many of Britt's teammates were drafted into professional football, including Callan. Though she was nationally ranked, she was not even invited to the draft, and not a single professional team had sought her out. She was resigned to the fact that pro football was just not ready to have a woman in their ranks. She was okay with that, though. She had trained and interned with active duty military personnel throughout her college career, and she had found her purpose in life. She couldn't wait to get her first assignment and get to work. She commissioned as a first lieutenant in the U.S. Army as an infantry officer. Through her distinguished performance and outstanding record throughout her 4 years of college, she had skipped the first officer rank that military academy graduates normally started their careers at, and she was immediately set on the fast track to military success. As her military career moved forward, propelled by her unending drive for success, she was offered prestigious opportunities that most females in the military didn't get the chance to experience. She was recruited into the Special Forces world and distinguished herself as a brilliant leader, battle-tested and proven time and time again. Charlie Edwards stayed with her at every turn and became a valued member of her team. He had never been allowed to play a football game in college. Callan became a professional football superstar and was treated with celebrity status everywhere he went.